On October 7th, terrorists invaded Israel by sea, land, and air, pillaged, raped, and murdered Israeli citizens of the Western Negev, and took hostages from those border communities back into Gaza. On October 7th, Israel's defense forces were overwhelmed, and the great project, the great challenge before Israel at that moment was to reassert its deterrence and to project power to its neighbors and throughout the region, to make sure that something like October 7th could never happen again. But on October 8th and October 9th, new theaters of war and new battlefields were articulated. These battlefields took place in prestige media, on college campuses, in the capitals throughout Europe and North America, in the international institutions of human rights and international law. This was where the battle of ideas would take place. The writer Milton Himmelfarb once wrote that the Jews are a small people, no larger than a rounding error in the Chinese census, and yet great things seem to happen in and through the Jews. Among the things we've learned over the course of the last year of such great civilizational consequence is that big questions related to America, Europe, and the West are all being asked in and around the Jews. Questions related to jihadism and Western civilization. Questions related to America and America's willingness to fight for itself, for its interests, for its way of life. Questions related to liberal education and the culture of our college campuses. My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow at Tikvah and the editor of Mosaic, and I've brought together a roundtable with some friends to help us think together about this past year and all that we can learn from it. I'm joined by Ruth Wisse, Emeritus Professor at Harvard University and Senior Fellow at Tikvah. I'm joined by Liel Leibovitz, the Editor-at-Large at Tablet and host of its podcast, Unorthodox. I'm joined by Elliot Kaufman, Letters Editor at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm joined by the very distinguished author and novelist, Dara Horn. Together we talk about what we've learned over the past year and what, in this most consequential Jewish year, we're now obliged to do. Well, here we are. It's nearly 1 year since, as so many in the Jewish community say over and over again, the deadliest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And that phrase stays with you. It's an unusual phrase. And maybe actually we ought to begin with that, and why people keep saying that, and why we can't think of some kind of catastrophe that happens to our people outside of the categories of the Shoah.
You know, the interesting thing about that is that it immediately sends people to talking about the Jews. It's the deadliest thing that happened since the Holocaust. And why? Because 1,200 Jews were killed, and because Jews were massacred in this way. I think I would put the emphasis on the other syllable. And I would say that the thing to think about is that who are these proto-Nazis, number one? Can you imagine that this is something that is being done in the West, like to a Western country, right? A massacre as horrific as something that was done in the Holocaust. And why that particular idea comes to mind is because of the kind of assault that it was. And in a sense, it was very different from the Holocaust. So I think that comparison is a very good place to begin, because the Nazis, for one thing, did not advertise what they were doing. They did not want their populations to actually know the worst that they were doing, that they were killing on their behalf, presumably, but they did it in secrecy. Here are people who are using this as advertising. This is a way of attracting people. But the worst of it is this is the first jihad against a Western-style country, and a country which is considered part of the West, and it's done to show that this is against the West. This was not a bombing. This is not a suicide bombing. This is not something that is done in some kind of quasi-respectable way. This is done with that brutality of rape and of burning babies and of showing the viciousness of it. And that is so stunning. You see, it's as if the message of Sinwar, certainly, and the message of that is so much to the West. Listen, forget about it. You think that we're people like you, that you're going to live side by side with us. This is your dream, Jewish guys, right? You've been courting us. You've been talking about economic improvement. Forget about it. This is who we are, and we're not going to let you live because we know what you need. You need civilization, and we're not going to allow it. And so the comparison hits me very, very hard. And just to turn it one more degree, the fact that this was hailed as it was in America means that jihad has come to America. And so the threat to this country is also very different from anything that hit it before. Because, the protests are being compared to the protests of the 60s. And the protests of the 60s were not about Jew killing in the most barbaric way, you understand? What is being hailed on the campuses? And don't tell me that they don't know. Anybody who doesn't know doesn't want to know. What's being hailed is this primitivism of our hatred and of what we intend. So the phrase, you see, is accurate in a way, but I would not like it to turn, as it has so quickly, to the suffering of the Jews. And this is our tendency, right? But we dare not focus on ourselves. This has nothing to do with us. Yes, we are the victims, but it has to do with the horror of what they have become and what they are asking us to understand about who they are.
See, to me, I obviously agree with you, Ruth, 100%, and not for the first time. But to me, this was one of the difficult reckonings of this past year, which I can't say fully surprised me, but really sort of sunk deep in a troubling way. And though, of course, and I think you cannot say it enough, the empathy, the heartbreak, the crazy sorrow that we feel for those still held in captivity and their families, are boundless. You look at the response. It's one thing to wake up one Shabbat morning and understand that your fever dream about civilization, and if only you allowed 15,000 more work permits to poor Gazans, you would have a long-lasting peace. And the Palestinians just want a sovereign state side by side with Israel to realize the same kind of national human aspirations. That's one thing. But then to see an entire year go by, and the key slogan that we generate as a result, and I've written about this, and John, you and I talked about this, is #bring them home now. I cannot tell you how thoroughly revolted and angered I am by the inanity and insidiousness of that slogan. To whom is that message directed, pray tell? Who should be doing the bringing? Magen David Adom, Red Star David, who? The UN? No, obviously the only people right now who have the power to do this, either Hamas to release the hostages or the IDF to go ahead and finish this war once and for all. The fact that we choose to put things in these mawkish terms, that we have designed a deliberately opaque slogan that I compared it several times before to Black Lives Matter, this kind of thing that you can absolutely not oppose without seeming like some sort of moral monster, but that holds within it layers and layers and layers of political machinations and operations against people who don't actually care about the end goal, but care about exerting their own political will against the will of the Israeli electorate, is very troubling to me. To me, the slogan that we ought to have united around is something like, kill all our enemies, or something like, complete victory now. And what we're seeing these last couple of days, we're speaking now in the aftermath of the stunning 9-day operation to literally wipe out the entirety of Hezbollah's leadership. is that total victory actually is very achievable. That this tale that the West has been telling itself since 1946, well, wars are very complicated and they're also kind of immoral, and therefore the best you can do really is diplomacy and you can't really fight to win. It's like, actually, guys, no, it's not true. When you have animals at the gate who wish to, devour you, here's what you do. You kill all the animals. This is not very complicated. Sometimes it may take some time and some resources, but Israel is proving very apt at this task. And yet, I feel like the majority of definitely the American Jewish community has not yet grasped that the path forward isn't those very somber and solemn gatherings in which we, sing low-key songs and, show pictures of suffering, nor do we communicate that the reason we deserve sympathy is that look what they've done to us. I don't care what they did to us, and I'm not looking for your sympathy. I am looking for securing my people, and thank God that unlike 1945, we have the means to do that right now. And that should be the major focus. And that this is considered provocative or political, and that so many people in the community still feel like, well, but of course, not all the Palestinians, but of course, most Gazans are total, innocent lambs. Sure, they've been hiding, a few hundred civilians in their apartments and keeping them as slaves, but they just want peace like everybody else. It's just a deranged conversation, and I'm sad to say that, things haven't changed much.
It is a deranged conversation, perhaps, that has very deep roots in the Jewish habit of mind. A Jewish habit of mind which does, over history, want to look for reasons for our persecution and suffering within. And that's not new to the Jewish story.
No, I should say that it isn't new, but just to pick up on it, listen, we have to be realistic here, and there is a reason for this. And one of the reasons has to do with the way that the Jews are constituted as a people. We are a minority by choice, and we are a self-accountable people. One of the reasons that we are so remarkable is because of this extraordinary civilization. I mean, consider this. Jews, we call ourselves the chosen people, the elect people. But what does that mean? What it means in practice is that we have chosen to put an extraordinary degree of pressure on ourselves to become the people that is worthy of being made in the image of God and living up to the Torah. But unlike many, many other peoples and certainly other religions, not everybody has to be a Jew, but anyone who wants to can become a Jew. You tell me a religion that has those two operatives together. This is extraordinary. So that's the extraordinary part internally. But you see, because you're a minority, we need coexistence. We're not imperial. We're not out to conquer any other people. And that is a tremendous handicap when you are surrounded by people who are peoples of conquest, who do want to conquer other territory, when most other countries and nations are expansionist in that way, quite naturally expansionist, not all. So we need coexistence when others don't. So there's a built-in asymmetry that is magnified now with the Arab world. There's never been as asymmetrical a war in history as the war of the Arab League and the Muslims against Israel. And it's now one of the longest wars in history. It's extraordinary. So in your terms, though, you see, it's not winnable, actually, because at the end of the day, yes, you can win this territory, and certainly you can win the much better geographic defensible territory than Israel has at the moment. But at the end of the day, Israel doesn't want to go into Damascus. It did not want to go and conquer Egypt, you see. And so that's a kind of a self-limiting thing which others take advantage of. They know that you don't want to conquer them. And one of the things that makes Jews the happy target that they are is that it's always profitable to destroy the Jews, and there's never a political price to pay. Right? Nobody else is going to make you pay for destroying the Jews. In fact, if you look at the world today, everybody seems to be enjoying it. Get them. Oh, maybe don't kill them all the way, but yeah, push them. It's like a show that everybody is watching, right? So just to say that there is something in the Jewish people and the way it's constituted that is marvelous. And if we were the only people in the world, let me put it the other way, that if everybody were like the Jews, then we would have no problem at all.
So this is something that Ruth and I have talked about before. When you talked about habits of mind, the term I coined for this is the Eicha problem, right? This is what I call the Eicha problem, Eicha Book of Lamentations. There's what I feel is there's this sort of pattern in Jewish, in Jewish traditional thought, which is to, as Ruth put it, sort of, that Jews blame their problems on themselves. And this is like a theological idea in Judaism, right? When you read the Book of Lamentations about the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians, it doesn't even really mention the Babylonians, right? This is considered the God is acting through the Babylonians, right? That this is, because Jerusalem has sinned, right? And this is a pattern that's repeated, throughout Jewish thought. I mean, then the temple's destroyed again by the Romans, hundreds of years later, and then, the rabbis of the Talmud are debating why was the temple destroyed? And they say, oh, it was destroyed because, people didn't observe the Sabbath, or it was destroyed because, we didn't educate our children in the Torah, and we didn't, it's because we, didn't fulfill XYZ commandment. Not one of these brilliant rabbis ever says it was destroyed because of the Roman superior weaponry, right? Like, this doesn't come up as an idea, right? It's like, it's this, as Ruth says, this solipsistic worldview where it's like, only my actions matter. And it's like, everyone else doesn't have agency. And that view comes from this sort of ancient idea that the actions of these other nations were actually God acting through these other nations. I mean, and this is such an ancient idea that it shouldn't even have any impact on a conversation like this. But I think it actually does, because I think that you see how that idea evolved in Jewish thinking. The example I often give is in the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik after the Kishinev pogrom, right? And which was, and it's funny, we talked before about you've talked about the Nazis didn't want to share their crimes. I feel like there actually is a lot, or it's not as intimate or something like that. I actually think there are a lot of parallels in terms of the intimacy of the violence. But what he's describing and what Bialik's describing the Kishinev pogrom, is very similar to October 7th in terms of what these people endured. But that's supposed to be this great break with tradition, because what he does in that poem is it's written like Eicha, like Lamentations, and so all these horrible things that have happened, and then he excoriates the Jewish community, because he sees the Jewish community then go back to the synagogue and they're reading Eicha, they're reading Lamentations, and they're confessing their sins and praying to be forgiven for their sins, because they're basing on this assumption that this happened because of something they did, right? And he's sort of yelling at them in this poem and saying, you fools, this isn't because of, it isn't because you weren't pious enough, it's because you didn't fight back. First of all, it's a problematic idea because there actually was self-defense in Kishinev and in many other places. But also, to me, what's interesting about that is he actually isn't breaking that chain of ideas.
Not at all.
No, because he still is saying it's the Jews' fault, right? He's just giving a different reason. It's like their fault because they didn't fight back successfully.
No,
enough,
not
right?
just that. He faults the men. He faults the men for not protecting the women.
Yes, I mean, it's really graphic and disturbing. And, and that's supposed to be this clarion call to Zionism. It's like, oh, the problem is that we haven't been defending ourselves, which, like I said, first of all, was false, historically false, not just in Kishinev, but there, in all of these situations, there was Jewish self-defense. It just wasn't successful. People were overwhelmed. But, also, to me, what's interesting to me is, this way of thinking, it's it still is, the foundation of so much of the way we in the Jewish community talk about all of any situation where the community is attacked. It's and that goes throughout the political spectrum, right? It's the Jews are attacked because they're too kind to their enemies. The Jews are attacked because they're not kind enough to their enemies. It's it still is it's something that the Jews did, right? That causes this, right? I mean, and to me, this is this baseline. It's sort of the premise of the whole tradition. And I mean, that's got pluses to it and minuses to it. But I think that we're sort of still walking in that habit of mind. And I actually would disagree with you, Liel, that about this is the one slogan we've come out of this is bring them home now. I think actually I've seen quite the opposite in the Jewish community, certainly in this country. I feel like there has actually been a tremendous awakening in the American Jewish community in this situation after what's happened in Israel, but also after what's happened here in the United States. I think that if anything, there's sort of the new slogan, so to speak, is Am Yisrael Chai, right? Is the eternalness of the Jewish people and the resilience of the Jewish people. I mean, so to me, it's like, the sort of slogans and theme songs that have come out of this in the American Jewish community are Am Yisrael Chai and Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael, right? Like the song that's, that we're praying for, which is related to the hostages, right? Because it's about those who are in captivity. But the idea that we are all brothers and sisters in the nation of Israel. To me, that has been sort of a sea change that you've seen in American Jewish life.
I would just say that most American Jews don't know what Achenu means. And so we're talking about a subset here. I mean, I think accountability and holding oneself, one's group accountable is extremely important. And in Israel, you can see this, and there's ample room for it. I mean, it was a real failing, a sin even, to fail to secure the Jewish people in that way. And Israel needs more accountability, not less. Probably we can all agree. Have American Jews looked at their own accountability? Or do they look at Israeli Jews' accountability? Because that takes on a different character when American Jews talk plenty and plenty about the Israeli government and its various failings and all of that without looking at themselves. When I ask how has the American Jewish community responded to October 7th, the war, everything, I think it's played it safe. That's how I would put it. The focus on the hostages, who can disagree? Bring them home, that slogan. Liel, I thought, made that point nicely. It's designed so that you can't argue with them. Surely you can't say someone who just wants hostages back is bad. But in truth, Israel wants more than that. It wants to destroy Hamas. It wants to return security to its northern citizens. How do you make that argument? Well, you take some risk. You might get counter arguments made against you in a way that wouldn't happen if you only talked about hostages. And I think you might also make some noise. Has the American Jewish community in Israel's time of need and peril really made itself a problem? For certain universities, I think it has actually. The answer is yes, it has made itself a problem and has had to be listened to some degree. I think AIPAC has made itself a problem in a few marginal seats, Democratic Party primaries across the country. But have Jews made themselves a problem for the Biden administration? Has their voice been heard? I think Jews have been outworked by Muslims in America.
Let me jump right into the trap that Dara so eloquently set for me. Knowing that I won't be able to resist.
You're ascribing a level of strategy to me that I totally lack.
You crafty Jews. It's always the machinations. I take the Eicha problem description very seriously. And yet, going back and reading Bialik, which, like so many of us, I have repeatedly this past year, there is something that feels so prescient and maddening to me. Because, to engage now in the favorite Jewish pastime of blaming the victims, you look at the last year in American public life, and here's what you see. American Jewish public life. I gave a talk not long ago in a very major Jewish institution. The flag that greeted me on the facade of the building as I entered was the trans pride flag. The Israeli flag was to be found in a far smaller installation inside the building. The JCRC of New York, and I believe they have to be named and shamed, chose as their theme just this week. The theme of the year, following immediately this, as you said, worst attack since the Holocaust, welcoming the stranger, because opening borders and letting in, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and unvetted people who evidently will end up attacking the Jewish community, that should be our communal, priority. And on the flip side, with all the talking and all the rage, here's what I don't see. I don't see enough instances, like we saw blessedly in UCLA, of Jews saying, I'm sorry, you want to do what? No, we're just not going to do that. If you come into this campus and you try to aggress against us, here's what we're going to do. We're going to aggress against you. There's one of the greatest videos that I've seen came 3 weeks after October 7th. It was taken off a security camera in Brighton Beach. And you see a young gentleman, probably in his 30s, tearing down hostage posters. And you see an old Russian man, probably in his 70s. And you see the look in his face very clearly. And the look in his face is, why are you doing this? I was going to buy a sandwich and enjoy my day. And now you left me no choice but to very violently beat you up. This was not my decision. This was your decision by doing this heinous thing, which of course is what proceeds to happen. Statistically, and I keep looking at this, there have been no instances reported in this particular neighborhood. And here's the thing. This mindset is a mindset that not just American Jews, I think, are stricken with. I'm very sad to say that it's also Israeli Jews. This is now...
Israeli Jews in America?
No, Israeli Jews in Israel. This is now, by some counts, the fifth or sixth kind of clash with Hamas. It is the third Lebanon war. At this point, I think Israelis ought to be smart enough to understand that this does not end without territorial conquest. Because every war since the dawn of man has only ended with territorial conquest. And we think we're so smart, if we could only get 400 beepers to explode, we will end the conflict in a more gentle, subtle way. It's not going to happen. There needs to be territorial conquest because there needs to be the sense that we won the war definitively. Israelis are so afraid of this. They're so unwilling to go ahead and say, you know what, I don't care what it is that you have to say or think. We're going to do the thing that it takes to protect ourselves.
So there's a way to draw the reaction, the Eicha problem that Dara was tracing for us, and say that there's some fundamental sense in which Zionism changed the Eicha problem. Or the aspiration of Zionism was to change the Eicha problem. Because you see, the reaction of American Jewry has very often been to say, we're a little ashamed at the strength of the IDF. And there are inner sources of our corruption that if we only purged, then we'll finally be worthy of the deference from the United Nations and from prestige media. If we only got rid of the Israeli politicians that the New York Times really doesn't like. If we only were able to limit more civilian casualties, if we could get rid of the sort of uncomfortable special pleading of the U.S.-Israel relation, of the lobby for the U.S.-Israel relationship, then we would finally be worthy of that deference. Zionism came along and said, we're not looking for the deference of the world any longer. That we are now able to raise an army that is the strongest Jewish army that has ever been in history. And that army is going to have the responsibility to protect our people. It's a fundamentally different way of orientation.
Absolutely, but again, let me just go back. Zionism succeeded beyond, or at least as well as, if not much better, than every other national liberation movement, of which, as we were saying before, there were dozens and dozens and all patterned on one another. Everything that depended on the Jews themselves, Zionism was superb at. Think of the absorption of immigrants. I mean, think of the fact that you now had a sovereign country, a sovereign state, that we were taking care of things. We've never had a sovereign state for 2,000 years. This dispersed people. The idea of taking 40 languages of the incoming immigrants and really, within one generation, consolidating Hebrew so that you have all this culture and this richness in Hebrew and playing with Hebrew and so on. I mean, what Zionism did is extraordinary. But the one thing that Zionism thought it would do is to end anti-Semitism, because its diagnosis was that anti-Semitism was caused by Jews in the diaspora. The Jews were in everybody's territory. And so the Germans said that the Jews were conquering us from within. And the Poles said that you were taking over our stores. Everybody had a complaint about the Jews. Zionism said, and this was Herzl's greatest impulse, you see, he wanted to save Europe, really, so that it could really be liberal. And one of the things that he felt was if you took the Jews out, then it would be able to experience its liberalism. The fact that the Jews were there was really it made something wrong, you see. Now, it was a miscalculation. No one could have foreseen that the Jews in their homeland would be as convenient an organizing target as the Jews in dispersion, and that it had nothing to do with the nature of the Jews. Nothing. To this day, it has nothing to do with the nature of the Jews. So what you're saying is worse even, because the fact that one tries to blame oneself is, from our own point of view, could be even constructive. Oh, so we do this better. Oh, so we do this better. But from the point of view of those attacking, the better Jews are, the more they will be attacked. The nature of the Jews is never the excuse for the attack against them. So think of this. You do all this, the energy of transforming yourself as a people. It's successful. Everything that we do for ourselves, we are great at. But the anti-Semitism against us is only greater. Why? Because the Arabs need it more than even the Europeans ever did. They need it for their purposes. They need someone to organize against. If you look at all the things that anti-Semitism does, as pointing the finger, deflecting attention from, negative campaigning, and most of all, I go through this, you see, to see what are the functions of anti-Semitism that make it so successful. The greatest one of those functions is as a consolidating thing. There is no other coalition builder in politics ever that has been as great as the coalition building of anti-Semitism. You just have to look at the United Nations. You just have to look at intersectionality on the campuses. So you see, the fact that anti-Semitism can work against the Jews in Israel, no matter how great they are, I mean, it was a blow. I mean, we have to face it. It's not a blow about the Jews. It's a blow about the world. And it's a real disappointment to have gone through this and to have made this transformation, you see, and they are not transformed by it. In fact...
Did you expect them to? Seriously? I'm not asking as a provocation. I'm asking...
Well, we have this discussion
I didn't understand
sometimes.
what you said about Herzl, though. Because you were saying, like, Herzl wanted to remove Jews from Europe to make...
I think
Europe more liberal. No, I thought that it was. I mean, I didn't understand it that way. I understood it as that he thinks, then they'd be a nation like all other nations, and the point is like, well, Jews spent 3,000 years not being like a nation all like all other nations, right? But this to me is a more interesting point. Is like when you said it's like it's disappointment about the world.
Yeah.
So I think it's. I see the Jewish people as a counterculture that runs through the whole history of the West. Right? This is a counterculture. And it's, in some ways, I mean, it's foundational to Western civilization, obviously, through its influence on Christianity, its influence on Islam, its influence on, Enlightenment ideas and all these other things. But it's also a challenge to all these non-Jewish societies, precisely because of what you said earlier, right? But because this is a group of people who doesn't seek to conquer others. And to me, this is all it's all a question about empires and how empires treat non-dominant cultures, right? Because that is, what I think is so interesting is like, the reason that people have so much of a hard time like defining like who are the Jews. I don't mean who is a Jew like in the Law of Return or something like that. I mean like the whole question of like every time I go and speak on a college campus and it comes up like, oh, are Jews a religion or Jews are race or Jews are nationality, and the answer is Jews predate all of those categories, right? Those categories are meaningless because Jews have been around for several thousand years before those categories existed. And the reality is Jews are a type of social group that's actually very common in the ancient Near East, right? You're a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture, right? What we call, that's a paragraph in English. In Hebrew, it's one word that's 2 letters long, But like,
and a shared lactose intolerance.
Yes, with shared, I mean, that's like, it's common to a lot of people in the world. There were a lot of groups like this in the ancient Near East. Like that was sort of just the social organization of the ancient Near East. The only reason that this is uncommon in the West today is because of the success of conquering empires, right? So starting with, empires in ancient times, but then also, if you think of Christianity and Islam as also, these were, we certainly historically, and, one could argue now, as you have, societies that were interested in conquest, right? So it's only because of the success of those empires, whether we politically they're an empire or culturally they're an empire, that's the reason that Jews don't fit into the current social fabric, is because we are this like the thing that survived from ancient times. Like, that's what's unusual, is that it was so rare. That there were lots of groups of people like this in ancient times, that we just happen to be the only one that are still here. Maybe not the only one, but certainly one of very, very few. So that's, the only exception, the only thing interesting about Jewish history in that sense is that it's so darn long. And you can see in this like a test case for the limits of a pluralistic society, right? Because that's the challenge that Jews place to a conquering empire, is that a conquering empire has this idea that it thinks that its own ideas are universal, and that this is like what all, good humans should agree on X, whatever X is this week, right? All good humans need to agree on X. And so anyone who's outside of that belief is, should be rejected from human society, right? And whatever X is varies on, what's, you believe that Jesus is Lord, or, you believe that central planning from the Comintern is what will bring us all, one world utopia, whatever it is. The problem is that that society has been defined by saying that Jews are outside of it. And here I'm drawing on David Nirenberg, he's a historian, wrote this book, Anti-Judaism, about this. And so that dynamic, that's the challenge that the continued existence of Jews has posed, because the problem is that what those societies realize is like, oh, actually our idea isn't universal. That is like very disturbing to this dominant society's sense of itself. And it's sort of like, it's like if I have to, I remember this even from being a student in college, and the first time I met someone who was the Christian from some rural area where they had never met a Jew before, and I was the first Jewish person they ever met, and we've all had this experience at some point in our lives. And I remember this person just being utterly puzzled and saying, I remember him saying to me, Dara, do you think that Judaism is true? And I'm like, short answer, yes. And then he's like, then why don't you want everyone to become Jewish? And I remember just being baffled. I was a teenager. I remember being like so baffled. Like, I'm like, if I have a favorite band, why do I need you to have the same favorite band as me?
Well,
right? Like, and it was sort of like this scrambling of radar that like, it's like, if like this, like, it doesn't compute that like there can be different ways of being in the world. And I think that is sort of this ultimate challenge that the continued existence of the Jewish people poses to these dominant civilizations.
Yeah, except for one thing. America is different. Britain was supposed to be different. I mean, that's what democracy is. So it doesn't fit that model. And
well, it challenges it, right? That's the challenge. That
well,
it's
it shouldn't have challenged America, you see. So to get to a different question here, isn't our shock, in a way, not just about what's happened to the Jews, but, we've said the shock of October 7th, what was greater to us, the shock of October 7th or the shock of October 8th? I don't know how you feel about that, but that 30 groups of Harvard would have been ready the next day to sign on to this, and that what has happened since in this country, in America, which was supposed to, you see, be a counter. It isn't an imperial country in that sense. I mean, if America were that kind of country, one would understand the way it functions. But it's supposed to be, a pluralistic society. It's supposed to be a society of all the groups that are in it. God knows there are stranger groups in America than the Jews, much stranger groups. And yet this world idea of organizing politics against the Jews works so phenomenally, and there are so many contributing groups that have consolidated around this idea that, in fact, it has penetrated the United States, and it has penetrated the campuses in a very explicit way. You had on the campuses groups that were forming that were grievance groups. All these groups were there, like against Wall Street, against this and that. That's all abstract. Come these people with a flag and a costume and a keffiyeh, and they say, no. The real organizing thing is it's against Israel. It's against the Jews. And at the United Nations, this has already been accomplished, right? That Zionism is racism. Of all the isms in the world, only Zionism is racism. So you see, anti-Semitism is a force. I mean, I've called it, without exaggeration, the most successful ideology of the modern world. And we can't face that. And if we want to stay sane as Jews, in a way, we shouldn't be able to face that so easily. We should be scratching our heads and saying about that part of it, certainly, how in the hell did that happen?
I have an answer to that.
Yes, we do.
And it's darker than yours. I regret to say, I felt many things on October 7th and on October 8th. I regret to say that shock or even mild surprise was not one of them. Not even a little bit. In fact, it proceeded precisely according to plan. Because you ask yourself the fundamental question that you sort of just implied, which is how do kids in college campuses who spend, the first 3 semesters of their Harvard education selecting their pronouns stand side by side with a genocidal, maniacal regime that is in charge of a sliver of land where 56% of women are domestically abused and gays and lesbians are executed on spot. It's a baffling question if you think about this logically. But I think there's actually kind of a simple explanation. And in a way, it almost has little to do with anti-Semitism, though it has much to do with the Jews. And the answer is simple. These people are pagans. I mean, we read the book of Leviticus. We read about groups of humans who believe in the great phrase that nothing is true and everything is permitted, that believe, to quote the title of the greatest book by the greatest, pagan poet, Ovid, that everything is in a sense of metamorphosis, everything is changing. Of course, gender is fluid. You can do whatever you want because you live in this kind of reality, and therefore they resort to the one thing that pagans have always resorted to, which is human sacrifice, especially of children. This is why you're seeing Hamas sacrifice, Jewish children and their own Palestinian children on the same altar. This is what pagans do. This is what pagans did from time immemorial, and this is who these people are. But I think at its heart, it's a religious problem, not a problem of anti-Semites versus the Jews, or the Muslims versus the Jews, or the Christian white nationalist extremists versus the Jews. But quite simply, as it has always been, the pagans versus the Jews. And here I also draw a lot of optimism because it's not just the pagans versus the Jews. It really is the pagans versus the believers. And when you look at this great godly country, we are in the absolute majority here. And I think a lot of people are waking up to the understanding that October 7th might have been an attack on Israel, but October 8th was an attack on America.
Yes. Yeah.
This is a very deep and important point. And if Judaism is anything, Judaism is against paganism. That is the great formula from Milton Himmelfarb, and he's right. And one of the things that one can actually look back across the last many months with gratitude and see that in very hope-giving ways, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans have stood up together with the Jewish people because they understand that our fight is a fight for the West and for America and Israel together. That's actually one of the bright spots of the last year.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think Walter Russell Mead has written well in his history of U.S.-Israel relations that when the Jews and Israel were weak, that it attracted American support. It was when Israel was strong and achieved substantial victories that all of a sudden the U.S. said, well, we have quite a useful ally here if only we would seize it. And that's when the U.S.-Israel relationship intensified, became what we know it as right now. And I think you see something like that throughout this war, if during those periods of the war when it seemed like Israel was mired in Gaza and, what's really happening, what's really being accomplished, you see declining support. People don't want to be associated with that sort of thing. When you see major victories day after day in Lebanon, all of a sudden you see people aligning themselves with it. When you see a success against Hamas, where it can't do anything right now to help Hezbollah, then I think people look far more positively on the war effort because people like wars that win. People like nations that succeed against their enemies rather than get caught up in what can seem like senseless violence forever. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be for that. And so I think many Americans have rallied to Israel's side. And the way I would frame the divide, I mean, I wouldn't even go to paganism and even try to explain what that means nowadays. I mean, in my view, there has never been a totalitarian or retrograde regime that the Western left hasn't apologized for, so long as that regime is anti-Western. And so when Judith Butler, the symbol of the sort of postmodern university, says that Hamas, Hezbollah, are part of the global left, she gets mocked for it. I think she's absolutely right. And it is demonstrated by how people act. They recognize these forces as they're fighting against the West. And therefore, they do function on the side of the left, and therefore they can count on support in the universities. It doesn't matter how they treat women. It doesn't matter how they treat gays. And we've seen Israel be twisted into something, and this is where Ruth's point, I think, is just brilliant about the organizing function of anti-Semitism. I mean, what do these different grievance groups care about? Well, if they care about racism, Israel's an apartheid country. It's the most racist country on earth. Didn't you know? Mm-hmm. If they care about the legacy of American colonialism, maybe you have Latino grievance groups who feel strongly about this. Well, Israel's the most colonialist country in the world. Didn't you know that? Native American grievance groups, they care about their land. Well, Israel stole the land. Israel stole more land than anybody you'll hear, you know? So Israel is able to be twisted to fit that picture of radical evil in a way that no other group or country is assigned, really, unless you reach back to the Nazis. And of course, that
basically the premise of Ta-Nehisi Coates' last book. You summed it up very eloquently right there.
Well, I think that that idea that Jews are put, and this is also in Nuremberg's thesis, right? I mean, but it's something that's familiar to, all of us is, it's like if it's a capitalist society, then Jews are communists. If it's a communist society, then Jews are capitalists. It's also, if it's a racist society, then Jews are an inferior race. And if it's an anti-racist society, then Jews are racist, right? And also, if it's a nationalist, if it glorifies, nationalism is glorified, then Jews are rootless cosmopolitans. And if it's a society where nationalism is vilified, then Jews are chauvinistic nationalists, right? I mean, this is like a dynamic that, it's very familiar. You don't have to look that far to find it, right? I want to sort of echo something that John said earlier, though, and maybe push back on some things that other people here have said, which is that there's so much more ignorance than malice in this country. Because I have spent the past, I guess it's now like 3 or 4 years since my last book came out, just traveling around the country speaking to lots of different audiences about these topics. And I'm amazed by how much goodwill there is, not just toward the Jewish community, but from people who you wouldn't expect. And including people in some of these groups that, have come up in this conversation just now. I mean, I've had Native American readers reach out to me, right? I mean, I've had people in all of these different minority groups reach out to me.
And Israel is an amazing story for them.
Yes,
for
well, that's
each
what I was
one
going to say.
of these
I feel
groups,
like they're
count it.
actually like, you can say it's like pagans versus believers, whatever. Like, that framing will resonate with some people, it won't resonate with others. I think it's just like normies.
Yes, but they're not
right, like normies versus people who are sort of cosplaying some kind of virtue signaling cause. I just think that there's so much more ignorance than malice, and to me this is something I've been thinking about, and I thought about this also, like when you said, how come the American Jewish community hasn't been bolder? I actually think that it has changed. I think this has changed. I think it's going to take longer to see more systemic change because it's only been a year, and when you're talking about large legacy organizations, it takes a long time, and especially and then with the help of smaller organizations, I actually do think there's a change. I think that there are a lot of organizations that used to not be out front by being like anti-Zionism. Yeah, actually it's anti-Semitism, who now have come around and get it. I've seen that very often and from places I wouldn't have expected it within the Jewish world and also outside the Jewish world. I have seen a lot of people who have sort of woken up to this problem. Maybe you're a little late to the party.
I hope you're right.
No,
I really do.
there's a lot of. I'm telling you that there's a lot of people who are sort of figuring this out.
By the way, I think it'll be crucial.
I don't think that there's. I mean, like, the vast majority of Americans are not in favor of, celebrating federally designated terrorist organizations. That is not something that 90% of Americans are behind. There are some loud people in college campuses, and that is a huge problem because, yes, that is thought leadership. There are some loud people in certain sectors of our society. But what I find is so amazing, because I speak about this stuff publicly all the time, is how many times I walk into some environment where the people there are expecting pushback. And I've done this so many times where I've gone to speak at in these quote elite institutions, right? I go speak at a college campus and I'll go to speak and, the people warn me all in advance. Like I even had somebody at one institution, which I'm not going to name, where in the little call before my talk, they were advising me. They're like, "Oh, you might want to be careful about using the Z word in your presentation." And I'm like, "Should I also be careful about using the J word because I don't want to offend anybody?" And then I get up and they hand me the microphone, I just drive a truck through it. I'm like, here's what you think and here's why you're wrong and here's an alternative view of this that actually involves people coming together and building a future together. Let's talk about how we want to build a future together. I've done this where I've spoken. I've even had the thing where I speak at some college campus and there's the kafia people who are heckling me. And then I respond to them as though, not heckling me getting me off a stage, but asking hostile questions, let's say. And it's amazing to me because I'll answer the hostile question and I always expect them to keep heckling and they don't. And then everybody else just gives me a round of applause and then they quietly leave and that's it. And then everyone's like, "Wow, we've been so scared of those 3 girls for this whole semester and you just flicked them over." And I'm like, "Yeah, wasn't that hard?" Most people are just waiting for somebody to stand up and say something. And then once somebody stands up and says something, this whole thing falls apart. It's like a house of cards.
Well,
so I feel like there's a lot of opportunity here, an enormous amount of, and also there are a lot of institutions that didn't know they had who are now been awakened to the reality of the problem and want to do something about it, right?
Yeah, but it's not our government, because let me just say that one of the things that occurred to me, you're both, right on the mark it's true that most people are like that, but it occurred to me that in the last war, the United States felt that it had gone to war sort of on the side of the Jews. They came in too late, to be sure, but they did win, finally, the war. And it seems to me now that it may be that the United States thinks that the Jews should return the favor, that we should be the ones who win the war for them, fight it for them, win it for them. So Israel should be not just the fighting front line, but the only army of America. We have to shoot down its enemies, and on the campuses too. It's as if the campuses are hell, not just because of the anti-Semitism or the Jewish problem. The campuses have been failing because of the totalitarian impulses that have been at work in the campuses themselves, and the failure of education, the kinds of things that Tikvah has been trying to really answer for, right? To really educate kids. And by the way, if you have grandchildren who've taken Tikvah programs, they come back and they say, they said, they can't go back to school easily after that anymore. They really can't. Why don't people teach like Tikvah? You see, why can't one really learn? Okay, so there are things really going on here that are great, but on the campuses too, they expect the Jews to be the ones to bear the burden of everything that is wrong at the university. So where are these good people? And I don't think, we are forced to play this role, and every one of us is forced to be a hero and to be a leader and so on, but we have to make the demand on this country. You're the United States of America. You should be fighting this war, right? So yes, we have to be the front line in a sense, and to take our share of the responsibility to go out there and do what you do.
That's precisely right. Look, I firmly believe that there's no problem with American universities currently that a little bit of light artillery cannot solve. But on a more serious note, I think that's precisely correct. It is a complete failure of leadership. When you see the Houthis block 20% of global commerce. And I don't know, who's president right now at the time of this recording? It is October 2024. We genuinely don't know. But to see this great country doing absolutely nothing is precisely the problem. I agree with Ruth completely that the Jews have to do something. But here's what I think the Jews have to do. First of all, and Dara, I cannot tell you, coming from you, how much your optimism means to me, because, I trust everything you say. This is the most difficult thing that you have ever said to me for me to accept, because when I look at Jewish organized community, but also individual Jews, yes, it is now our turn to save this country. I dare say this has been our historical role. I dare say that the moral foundations of this country are profoundly Jewish. I dare also say that this country needs us far more than we need it, and I see it as a sense of great goodness that we have the ability to participate in this, divinely elected country and its, chosen mission. I believe completely in American exceptionalism. But for that to move in the right direction, the Jews have to do something. And the Jews currently are afflicted by a terrible public health crisis of prestige addiction. They cannot imagine a future in which they don't go to these universities. They cannot imagine a future in which they do not read these newspapers or apply to these plum jobs in corporations that have made it very clear that they prefer to live by a set of rules that excludes everything that we believe in and stand for, and everything that America believes in and stand for. The amount of money that goes to fight anti-Semitism on college campuses could have built an entire different infrastructure of much better schools that would have educated a whole generation of amazing fighting Jews, but we can't do it. We're just addicted. We have to continue arguing with them. No, we're not really bad. Here, let us bring a speaker on campus that would come and say these things. Why? Why are we talking to these people? You want to live with the Hamasniks? Hate. Go right ahead.
So I have a question for you, though. So, because I've heard you make this argument before. And
since 2017.
No, I've heard you make this argument before. And this is the piece that I think is missing here. We actually cannot do this alone.
Yes,
and we actually cannot. And this idea that we're going to go build a bunch of new colleges. It's like, no, you're not going to go build thousands of colleges when you're 2% of the population. And there's no more land grant system that made that possible for colleges to be built in the 19th century. And you're not going to go, develop a whole bunch of new engineering schools. No, you're not doing that alone. It's not possible. And so this is, to me, I think that this is a moment when there's an opportunity to take advantage of people.
Convert.
It's not about convert. No, but this is what I mean. This is what I mean. And this is why also, I get very frustrated by the
mitzvah tanks in every campus.
Well, no, what I get frustrated by is even this sort of, this idea that it's it's, the solution to this is everyone has to vote this way or everyone has to vote that way. It's you're going to need allies in both parties if any legislation is ever going to get passed ever. You have to. So, and then it's we have to end, name whatever policy you don't like that's in schools and corporate. And it's the way to affect those policies is to be in the room with the people who are making those decisions and to be one of the people making those decisions. And in other words, the idea of, I think that yes, there's a lot of room for new institutions. Absolutely. And we should be building as many new institutions as we can. I think that there's a lot of room to be also taking advantage of this moment where there are a lot of people who are waking up to this problem and who want to do something differently. And the fact that they want to do something differently doesn't mean we're going to set fire to, name the institution. It means that you want to do something differently? Let's talk. Let's put your money where your mouth is and let's talk. And then I feel I think that there's so many, it's a both and, but I do think that I do know that the way to lose half of the people who actually might have been curious about how we can build a future together is to dismiss them as all these institutions are wrong, all these institutions are bad, all of these, fill in the blank groups are not on our side, all of these people are not. It's
no one has been doing that.
I have been shocked.
Right.
When I speak about my work in all these different settings, I have been shocked who our allies are. It's never who I think it is.
I don't disagree with that.
And this is, and I think like that to me, it's like there's just so much opportunity to build bridges, and not just build bridges, but there's so much opportunity to build things together.
I agree. I think we're actually much closer than you would like to admit. The difference, and I think it's a very big difference, is this. First of all, I do believe that as October 7th kind of shows, that we are living in a monumental period in history. We all attend school and we all go to history classes, and we're taught there about eras, right? Oh, this was the Dark Ages, this was the Renaissance. And it's quaint little things that belong in the past, but of course we live in the present. We're totally free of this kind of, way that history works. I firmly believe that we are living in an end of a historical era. You could call it the end of the Enlightenment, you could come up with better terms, but a moment in which these institutions and ways of life, which have been very normal for 350 years, which to a mountain or a tree is, just a second in time, are being very seriously questioned. When you are looking, for example, at a government that opens the borders, the most clear definition of national sovereignty, and this is not at all a problem, to talk about policies, that ship has sailed a long time ago. There are no more policies. There are no more discussions. Sit down and agree. There is moral leadership and clarity. How do you get these people? You get these people by showing them, these allies, I'm never talking about doing anything alone, but you get these people by showing them that you are the one who is taking the lead. By saying, hey guys, I'm leaving. I'm starting this new school. It doesn't have to be 1,000. It could be 3. If you want to come along, leave Harvard right now. Join me in, Kollel of, Western Brooklyn. And once that happens, and once Harvard goes from great to finishing schools to the sons and daughters of the Chinese Communist Party and the Qatari royalty, which it already is, if we're honest, that is the way that you affect change, by actually living these values and showing the rest of America, hey guys, we're not afraid and we don't believe any of these nonsense and we're just walking out because we're smarter than that. They will follow this way. As Elliot said, this is America, baby. Everybody likes winners. Let's behave like winners.
And
but what I'm saying is you can do all of those things at once.
I agree that this is a moment of great opportunity. I heard Bret Stephens say the same line twice, okay? I heard him say it at Temple Emmanuel, Reform flagship, and at the Jewish Center.
Was it, I'm an undecided
flagship. Voter? Not quite. But what he said was, you know what? Israel is going to be okay. It's America that I am worried about. And got huge, rousing applause at both. Part of me agrees with him. And seeing so many American Jews agree and sort of accept that there's something at risk here in America. There's something wrong and we need to do something about it. That is the cause for the opportunity. But part of me very strongly disagrees with Bret Stephens and thinks, you know what? American Jews are going to be okay. It's Israel I'm worried about. It's being attacked on 7 fronts by militaries. Iran is this close to a nuclear weapon. And I worry that American Jews, in this moment of opportunity, in finally focusing on the risks to themselves, which are real, and so therefore focusing on education primarily, but also a few other things, they're thinking about themselves and not Israel in this crucial moment. And so I am optimistic about these changes happening in the American Jewish community. I think it will take a long time, you're right, but there are things changing, they're moving. But, Israel hasn't had that long to wait while this war has been going on. And I worry that some of the opportunity for American Jews to make a difference has been missed. But some of it is still there. And so I would just love that focus to be on Israel and for American Jews to get us animated about U.S.-Israel policy in the way that they do about Harvard University policy.
Well, that there are a lot of people who are motivated to do exactly that. But,
I feel like most people are.
The fact is that we do have an Achilles heel as a people. That is to say that for 2,000 years, we have not functioned as a polity. And we don't understand that the United States of America and other countries function as polities. You have, especially in foreign affairs. So if you want to see what you want done, which I agree with totally, even as a priority, I would say that you have to focus on the government in power. It's not as you say, of course we want, bipartisanship means that both parties should be for Israel.
Yes.
It does not mean that a Jew should be for both parties. Jews really interpret it that way, right? You have to make sure that there is somebody in charge who is going to have, get into that war and help. Because in the long run, of course, Israel is not alone. I mean, it's very nice for someone to write a wonderful book called Israel Alone. Yes, it's great. But we know that you need alliances of the real kind, the alliances who can help to protect and who can help to arm and who can help to fund and who can basically help politically in extending your range of activities. And this is a front where a lot of Jews have gotten better at it.
In said author's defense, that is precisely what he meant. He meant the aloneness of the moral courage is the way to draw people into this coalition of the willing to this fight.
Exactly, right.
Because otherwise it would be a disaster. And yes, this is a very big challenge. But look, I'm tremendously optimistic, not in the short or medium range, but in the long term. Because I believe that there is something very special about these two nations, America and Israel. I believe that they're the only two covenantal nations in the world. I believe that a covenant, unlike a social contract, is renewed every 100 years or so. We've done it in America several times already, and we're doing it in Israel now for the first time and very successfully. And I understand the despair, but imagine we were having a conversation in 1857 about the state of America, right? And you would have said, "Oh my God, this country's done. It's gone. Look at it. Like new slave states joining every day and like can't figure this stuff out. There are literal fistfights in the floor of Congress. I mean, who's going to save us? It's like depresso, lanky, morose lawyer from Illinois who spends his entire day debating. Come on, we have no real serious leadership." And a decade later, we were not just transformed, not just recommitted to founding principles, but ascendant as a global power. Because we renewed the covenant in a way that made the country look nothing like it did, the moment before. This is what we're doing right now in America. And it's not surprising to me at all that the Jews are at the core of this process because this is precisely where we belong. It is a covenantal moment. And we're the ones, with the reminder, kind of sounding the alarm, hey guys, it is time to recommit ourselves to the things that matter. And if it takes a sort of, it appears partisan or it appears, antithetical to the progressive values to which we've been committed for the past 50 years, so be it. These are far more eternal and true values that we're,
I want to turn our attention to Israel because, as you say, something similar is happening there. And we can't escape, of all the things that we've learned over the past many months, we can't escape observing that Israel has gone from a year preceding October 7th of intense civil strife, where vigorous disagreements amongst one another, to right after October 7th, a kind of the filigrees and filaments of society snap, and all of a sudden there's a kind of solidarity that in decadent, isolated, lonely America we look on with a kind of fondness because of how impressive it was immediately in response. But there's been something more too, which is, I would say, that this has been the occasion of a theological renewal in Israel as well. That one sees, now in the season that we're having this conversation, one sees clips on Twitter of slichot being recited in tanks. And you can't help but be impressed at the soldiers from Gaza watching the brit of their son on their phone because they were called into service. And as you say, that immediately after Nasrallah was killed on the Saturday evening, when the news reports came back online, that viewers were greeted with a Shechianu and song. And this is Menachem Begin's Israel. This is something, a kind of renewal that we're seeing there too.
Yes. My question really is, what about the culture, which is so very important, although I may put the emphasis on the polity, which is even more important in a sense. the big disappointment that we haven't talked about, because this is a cultural institution, is both American Jews and Israeli Jews. The most disappointing part of all is Israel is, I would say, the most hopeful sign of civilization since the dove returned to Noah with the olive branch. Think of it. After the Second World War, that you should have the resurrection of Israel 3 years later. It is the most astonishing thing. What have our filmmakers, what have our writers, what have our poets, what have they done that is in any way commensurate with this accomplishment? I mean, the movies that were made about this are either apologetic or they were made by non-Jews. It's as if there's something...
And in America tended to universalize the Israeli story.
And to tend to universalize this. And we have prize-giving institutions. We have so many... we have such a hunger for, and such a creative body of people creating this culture on every level. And there's... all that we've said here with the pride, with the affirmation, and both the fear and the grandeur of it, that has not been picked up in some way. It's not that we're sitting here waiting for it. And as a matter of fact, one of Dara's books is astonishingly helpful at this moment to me, Eternal Life. She has a book which is really feels very much like this moment, as if you've only lived in order to die, in order to live, in order to be disappointed again, and so on. So that kind of thing is very powerful too. There's not just a rah-rah that you're looking for. But in a sense, you understand that the story of Israel, as you say, and what you were saying before, and what all of us here feel for this and know about it, that has not been transmitted, and that would be a way of speaking to the country at
Well, you
large.
might be pleased to know that I've negotiated the film rights for that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that is changing.
Yes.
That is
Okay.
changing.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's, yeah.
Yeah, but that isn't yes, but that would not answer my sense of the needs of the moment.
So a dark point followed by a much more hopeful one. The dark point is, John, I actually disagree with you. I don't think this is a moment of the sort of film and snapping together. I think that the divisions in Israeli society that you have seen before...
No, they're back. Yes. They
will be back with a vengeance. Because the question that we're negotiating here, or litigating here, is the foundational, fundamental question of Zionism, which is whether or not we want a Jewish state or a state for the Jews. The differences are immense. And complex. I think it is fair to say that about 80% of Israelis feel very strongly that they want a Jewish state, and about 20% of Israelis feel very strongly that they would like Berlin or Milan or London, just with some, Jewish wallpaper, so it kind of looks nice and feels warm and nostalgic and cozy. I'm being just a little more cynical than I ought to be, but it is a profound difference that we're kind of living through, and it has everything to do with culture. With your notion of where the great good lies. Israeli culture, and I think this is the most absolutely hopeful sign that you could take. It's not just that the country's coming together in time of war and fighting this, challenge with such great resilience and unity, at least for now. It's the fact that for a decade now, we've had and witnessed the creation of an enormously influential and moving culture that is based on us, on our roots, on our traditions. And all of a sudden you have someone like Yishai Ribo, a Haredi singer, come and sing a hit song based on Masechet Yoma from the Talmud about the duties of the high priest and Yom Kippur. It is nothing short of miraculous that you have shows like Shtisel and Sugim that take faith seriously, unlike Netflix, where all you get when it comes to the Jews is yet another show about cute interfaith romance between a hot rabbi and a blonde podcaster. This is a serious culture of serious people who are really rooted in their tradition. Of course, Israeli officialdom fights it with all its might. It is still very, very hard for quote-unquote religious entertainers in Israel to break through this kind of monopoly. It's like, well, to be a serious author, of course, you have to be Amos Oz or David Grossman and come and say, I'm very troubled by the occupation. And then you go to Berlin and receive your prize and your $15,000 and give a very critical speech and say that the soul of Israel is in trouble. But it is getting there because a majority of the people are manifesting it. I totally agree that there is absolute lack of anything resembling this here in the United States. But I think that this is a tremendous opportunity for Israel to invert the relationship and actually lead by example and deliver onto us not just the joy and the hope, as Ruth so eloquently said, of its existence and of being, Zionism being this great anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist movement of the return of, the Jewish people to their indigenous homeland, to the inspiration of everyone in Western civilization, but just even culture that roots us back in who we are and what we believe. Because without that, unless we here take it on as a great big project to relearn, and this is not a call for, Frumkeit, though I would be very happy if more of that happens. This is a call to reacquaint yourself with to be culturally literate in Jewish culture. Tikvah does an amazing job helping everyone with that. Everyone around this table has played an incredibly large part. But this is the future direction, and the future is very bright.
I feel that the same way, and I to push back on what Ruth said about that there's been this weakening of culture. I think the opposite, and I think it has happened in recent years, like in the past 10 or 15 years, and it has mostly been centered in music. Right? I mean, you're sort of pointing to film. I feel like, even film, it's just I feel like the way that we consume culture has changed, and it's no longer about a big Hollywood blockbuster. And when you think about Israeli TV, I mean, one thing that I did with my family after, hearing about, the demise of Hezbollah was, I started rewatching with my kids the Israeli TV show Tehran, right? Because I have a bunch of teenage boys at home who are into that kind of cheesy spy thriller stuff. But we around the dinner table we're talking about Hezbollah and how this was the pager attack and all these things, and then we're what? There's a TV show that came out a few years ago that now you guys are old enough to watch and would really enjoy, right? But it's it's not the finest work of art, but it's that kind. But what I think that there's actually a lot, and I think, you mentioned Yishai Ribo. It's not just Yishai Ribo. There's a whole musical scene that is built out of things like, medieval Hebrew poetry, right? Or piyutim, right? I mean, there's a whole sort of piyut genre that's popular. I mean, that's not geared at people who would typically have read these piyutim in a siddur, right? I mean, it's, this is a popular genre. I was just speaking with a friend of mine who's, as secular as they come, and was just telling me, it's and my husband and I were at this slichot concert last night, right? And it's yes, there was a slichot concert, right? It wasn't the same as davening for slichot. It was a slichot concert in Tel Aviv. That was, that's sort of the new form of culture that is I do think that there's been an enormous change, certainly in the last 15 years for sure.
What unites both Shtisel and Srugim and Fauda and Tehran and all of that, and Yishai Ribo for that matter, the re-embrace of Paitanut is to be confident in the assertiveness of Jewish culture and Jewish power, and to not run from it, but to embrace that as who we are. And so there are there are signs. And by the way, by the way, in the America that also exists outside of the campuses, the show The Chosen is a gigantically successful show that first couldn't be bankrolled by the main production houses and had to fund itself, and then became so unbelievably popular. This is a show which traces the life of Jesus. Okay, it became so unbelievably popular among the Am Haaretz of America that then it was reacquired by Paramount or whoever, I forget who. But the point is that if the makers of culture were to say, actually, biblical epic is a genre that Americans will like if you treat them respectfully, and don't, as some have tried to do in recent years, actually use the epic as a way to poke fun at Americans and their religious beliefs. There's a gigantic appetite for that. That's actually something else.
Are you arguing against the life of Brian?
I'm saying that.
To be fair, that wasn't American, but
to make
there's a place for
to recreate the drama of Exodus, and make Moses make God into a petulant child who's arguing with Moses as a psychotic, that is something which can only offend Americans. It makes no sense when the opposite is actually true. I think there are signs of regrowth. Signs of growth.
Well, but that's okay. So I could speak to this as someone who works as an artist. Is this is about market. This is about market share. There's an enormous Christian market in America. That's like, that's not surprising to anybody. Okay, maybe it's surprising of who wants to pay for it. Okay. But like, zero surprise there. But I'll tell you, if I sell film rights to my book, it's going to be to a small studio that's going to, not have like huge ambitions for it. For now, okay. But what I'm saying is like, there's a natural limitation in terms of like this being a really tiny group, right? I mean, this is like, we're not a minority like Black Americans, where it's 15% of the population, and also is like, so central to the story that America tells itself about who it is and all of that, and is of interest to so many people. Like, we're very tiny. So like, there's ways I have spent my whole career finding ways around that puzzle, and I have succeeded in a lot of ways, and I obviously have many, many non-Jewish readers for all of my books. But I will tell you that like this is just this is a marketing issue where it's quite frankly numbers.
I totally
quite
disagree.
Frankly numbers, and I wish I had the luxury of disagreeing, but as an artist I can't.
No, but hold on. But let me complicate this tremendously as someone who has the misfortune of looking at the rug from the other side. We are right now experiencing a moment of great revolt in which cultural institutions who have decided against any and all market consideration in Soviet ways to cram down the throat of Americans, and this has been going on for more than a decade, things that no one actually wants. The thirst that is out there is a thirst for faith. Some people like it in a very Christian flavor, some people like it in a very Jewish flavor, and yes, there are limited markets for each one of these flavors, some very large, some very small. The thirst for actual faith, for just having this conversation about God, which has been completely prohibited in this desiccated culture that these, awful human beings,
these pagans
have thrust upon this godly nation. That is changing. That is why every single major rapper these days, from Chance the Rapper onwards, sings about God. This is why Justin Bieber sounds like a preacher these days. These people understand, what actually makes for great art. And let's be really honest, great art is almost impossible to imagine without religious yearning, without, some kind of desire for transcendence. This has always been true. That they have been successful in seizing a bunch of institutions and shutting down all dissent, sure, they had their 50 years, just like the Soviets did. But these systems always collapse. So may your book and the movie it makes have a very large audience. Amen.
My friends, we have to bring this conversation to a close. Let me just close by asking each of you a hard question, but an important one. What should we do? We have said, we've spoken about how there are potential alliances in a country that is actually quite open to celebrating the contributions that Jews have made to America and the West. But that depends on Jews understanding themselves the right way. So how should we understand ourselves, and what do we have to offer them?
I think we've gone a long way to talk about that here. I'll be very crude about it. I think that what we have to do in the world that I inhabit, namely the universities and education, what you have to go out there and you have to say no to jihad, quite explicitly. But we have to say, America, you have got to kick these people out. Do you know that Germany has just decided that as one of its criteria for citizenship and for allowing people into the country is the fact that they accept the idea of the Jews and the Jewish people. If they are not willing to accept that, they're going to ask the question explicitly about the Holocaust, but not just that, about the state of Israel. If you don't answer that question correctly, you do not get into Germany. Well, I don't understand an institution of higher learning that allows people to come in that does not accept the legitimacy and the unquestioned right of the state of Israel on the map to exist. That should be the first question that one asks as a question of entry into a university, knowing the degree of the entry of jihad into this country as one of its greatest fears for the country itself, especially in the field of truth and in the field of education and higher ideas. So put it only in the negative, because we've said all these things about yes and yes to all these obviously wonderful things that we have. But there is a time when you have to say no. And you have to teach the country that it's not wrong, that to have real liberalism, you have to say no to evil. That's number one, and you have to create the environment for the possibility of free speech before you preach it. Right? You cannot allow people who have come in with an ideology that is anti-free speech to be the ones to whom you give the classroom to teach those ideologies. So I think more and more, we have to play that role, and that's not a role for us. It's a question of life and death, because they're out primarily it's our books that they don't want. I mean, the Jews, there's much been said now about the fact that the Jews are not popular. I was blessed to thrive in the period of grace in American life, when the Jews were very popular, and when people liked the idea of what the Jews represented, and it was so interesting, and these were the writers, and these were the people who felt the freedom to express themselves for good and bad for any other way, right? In order to get back there, one has to say no to their saying no to us. There's just, no one else is going to do it.
I think, John, the short answer to your question is always listen to Ruth Wisse. The slightly longer answer is every Jew should go out today and purchase two things. The first is a gun, the second is a Bible, and learn how to really be familiar with both. Know how to defend yourselves, be armed, because there are real dangers, and all of your intellectual, nimmy nonsense is not going to protect you when the jihadists knock at your door, which they will, and we have seen this past year in America. The second is a Torah. Be familiar with it. Understand what your cultural heritage is. Understand that it is yours. Understand that unless you're rooted in it, conversant with it, fluent in it, motivated by it, you're not going anywhere. You have been given the gift of the greatest resource of renewable spiritual energy humankind has ever received. Use it.
Elliot?
I guess I would say Jews should be willing to make more trouble and make more noise, and understanding that to do so for a Democratic Party president doesn't mean you love Trump. It doesn't have to mean that. It means recognizing that you have interests. And I think Jews are afraid to recognize that. I think they have been for a long time. They think they're too enlightened to have interests. Well, after October 7th, one of the things that has changed, Jews do see that. And I think they need to know that their interests are not petty. Their interests can be enlightened. And be willing to become a problem for various people in power, and demand that their interests be taken into account. And I think American Jews can learn from Zionism. We talked some about the cultural angle in Israel. I think there is a political education to be had. Zionism has both utopianism and realism. In the past, maybe Americans have emphasized utopianism, and we have, in some of our conversation about, Zionism, thinking it'll end anti-Semitism. In my reading, I think the major Zionists got over that one fairly quickly. They realized it wasn't going to happen, and that power might need to be deployed. Alliances might need to be struck. Action might need to be taken, even if a great power didn't like it, and even if you couldn't afford to permanently say no to all great powers. And I think there are real political lessons we can draw from Israel's experience right now. Israel looks more utopian all the time as its enemies attack it, that project, and yet it has to be fought for, and those tough decisions have to be made. And if they're not, the whole dream falls apart.
I remember one college, I've told this story before, but I remember one college that I spoke at last semester, and I was speaking to Jewish students there, and one student was telling me how, there was another student in the class she was in who was making anti-Semitic comments in class, and, the professor's not pushing back at all. He's like, oh, it's an interesting perspective and all that. And she told me, I didn't say anything because I knew that if I did, I'd be, ostracized on campus, I'd be doxxed online or whatever, I'd be pilloried by all my peers. And of course she was right. And she said, but I wish I had said something. And here's the thing that she wasn't thinking far enough ahead, right? She's going to have to live with these people for the next 3 months or the next 3 years, but she's going to spend the rest of her life living with herself. And also what she'll never discover, because she didn't say anything, is how many people are just sitting around waiting for someone to say it. Like, it turns out everyone is actually just waiting for somebody to say it. So the way I think of this is, in the Purim Megillah, right? There's that moment where Esther is, Mordechai tells her to go to the king, and he says, he tells her about that there's this, decree, and she has to kill all the Jews. She has to go to the king, and she says, if I go to the king, I could be killed. Or canceled or doxxed. And he says, maybe this is the moment. This is the reason you became queen, was to use your power in this moment, right? And what's amazing to me at that moment is that, she goes to the king and it turns out he's actually on her side, right? He's like, oh, did I sign that decree? I must have been drunk, right? It's I feel like half the people are basically signing this decree because they're drunk, right? It's so fun. One of my teenage sons encountered this in some whatever Discord server he was online with, fans of whatever the flavor of the day of his hobbies were. And there was one day, in the past year where on this Discord server, they were like, Zionists will no longer be tolerated on our server, where we draw pictures of cartoon cats. And my son's like, we're drawing cartoon cats, guys, what's this about? And so my son actually went to these people who had posted, this is Hamas is the liberation and blah, blah, blah. And he just went to them individually and was sort of like, I don't know if you know what Hamas actually is, but, just so you know. And he filled this in, and he was shocked that these people wrote back to him and said, oh, sorry, I didn't know that much about this. I just posted this because everyone else did. Right? It's like everyone is Achashverosh. Did I sign this decree? I must have been drunk. Right? There's so much more. There's just so much more ignorance than malice, and that is an opportunity. So, my message from this moment is this is our Queen Esther moment where all of us have to stand up, and because really everyone is just Achashverosh, and that's an opportunity.
Okay, so for helping us to recover the Jewish imperative to pride and self-assertion, for helping us recover just how important it is that Jews actually participate with the fullness of our voice, the democratic logic of American self-government, for helping us to recover the Jewish imperative to strengthen the moral foundations of Republican self-government and the West itself, and for reminding us, Liel, that for all of the enlightened ideas that we have that inspire us, we can't forget the tough-minded necessity to defend ourselves, sometimes physically. My friends, thank you so much for helping us understand this year and this moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for convening us.